Good day, everyone. It's on behalf of the Basic Income Earth Network, BN, and the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, I would like to welcome you all for joining us today for this event on the perspectives of basic income to operationalize the Leaving No One Behind. It is my pleasure to be your moderator today. My name is Renata Rubian, and I'm a Global Advisor on Inclusive Growth with UNDP. We have lined up an exciting panel for you with experts from ILO, ECLAC, ESCOA, UNESCO, Unito, the World Bank, the IMF, SOAS, as well as BN and UNDP. The event today is divided into 3 segments. Our first panel will cover the potential of UBI as a policy tool to advance social protection and social economic recovery. Our second panel will deep dive into UBI implementation challenges and opportunities. And finally, our third segment will be an interactive discussion with our panelists. We hope you can stay with us for the entire event. Just a quick note that if you are interested in submitting your comments and questions for our panelists, please ensure that when you have joined this event, you have opted to join with WUVA, which has an enabled chat room. So before I introduce our first panel, I'd like to invite our co-host and partner from BN, Mr. Sarat Davala, to deliver introductory remarks. Sarat, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Renata. I'll be brief. Distinguished speakers from different organizations and brothers and sisters from all parts of the world. It's an honor and such a pleasure to welcome you all to this roundtable, which is a collaboration between BN and UNDP. And basic income is a great idea, but just ideas are not enough. What we need is action on the ground. And we are so happy that all of the speakers here represent that action part at the ground level, at the same time reflecting. So I think for the first time, our generation is really facing the extinction threat, the human extinction threat. I think this is the time all of us have to come together with great ideas plus action. And on behalf of BN, I welcome you all and thank you so much and good luck for this session, Renata. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarat. Dear colleagues, we have seen that across the world, how well-functioning social protection programs could be effective in helping the most vulnerable groups of people to cope with the socioeconomic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. So our first panel will cover the potential of UBI as a policy tool to advance social protection and socioeconomic recovery. So our panelists will deep dive on the interplay of UBI with other agendas such as climate change, rising inequalities, the COVID-19 socioeconomic impacts, and the informal economy, and what are the variety of motives that countries and governments have to promote UBI as a policy instrument. Our panel will also contextualize across regions of the world. They will include issues related to targeting or universalism. They will explore dimensions of traditional and innovative sources of financing to assess in what circumstances social protection coverage has been effective and likely to promote social mobility, protection, and increase production. A key question that our panel will explore is whether UBI is indeed an optimum social policy instrument to achieve income security, social cohesion, and justice, including in crisis and non-crisis context, and how it relates to the role of the welfare state, traditional, and other sources of finance. So without overdue, I would like to invite our panelists from UNDP, ILO, ECLAC, ESCOA, UNESCO to please start with their remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. Truly a privilege. Let me start by pointing to 3 issues that stand out in Asia Pacific. The region, as the world, faces a twin challenge: climate change and the COVID pandemic. This calls for globally coordinated action now, since policies on climate change will bring results with years of lag. This makes the coming decade the most consequential one in human history. The second issue is that inequality has increased steadily within Asia-Pacific countries. A considerable part of the population has seen its risk of falling into poverty rise. The bottom decile is overwhelmed, facing falling income and rising risks. Meanwhile, the top decile has amassed political power and other means to secure a disproportionate share of income and advantages for itself. Social protection systems in most countries of Asia-Pacific, and that's the third issue, have a gaping hole, reflecting the high level of informality and COVID-induced shocks. Well over half the population has no access to any social protection scheme. Against this backdrop, a universal basic income scheme ensuring a modest minimum income to all citizens can be useful. It needs to complement existing social programs to avoid duplication of support. A flat transfer adds a larger share of income for poor people than for rich ones, raising progressivity. And keeping transfers modest avoids the erosion of incentives to work, save, and invest. A UBI can act as a glue that keeps the social contract intact. It alleviates extreme poverty, reduces income inequality, supports aggregate demand, and improves health by making preventive treatment affordable. It allows risk-taking in the labor market and in entrepreneurship, making job search more fruitful, and enables people to insure against adverse outcomes. A UBI can reach those in the informal sector, improve the greenness of adjustment packages since environmentally disastrous coping strategies are no longer needed, and bolster social, including intergenerational mobility, by allowing people to take calculated risks and by making education and health services more accessible. High fiscal costs have constrained the use of unconditional UBI in the past, and this is likely to remain the case in the future. To support the vulnerable at manageable fiscal costs, governments could consider elements of targeting and minimizing duplication. For instance, offering UBI to a well-chosen part of the population with easily verifiable characteristics, such as age, or encouraging self-selection by allowing people with no formal income to opt in for a UBI as the only social protection payment they receive, other than social insurance, of course, which is a manageable wrinkle around this problem. UBI needs to be complemented by making workers more employable and deploying them in areas where they have comparative advantage. Technology can help, for instance, apps that bridge the skills gap with algorithms that effectively match people's skill sets with needs, allowing for learning on the job. To summarize, policymakers need to weigh both the costs and benefits of a UBI embedded in an overall strategy to remain within available fiscal space. A modest UBI that avoids duplicating existing social programs holds the promise of markedly improving economic efficiency, well-being, and social sustainability without eroding overall fiscal space. In a crisis situation, as advocated by UNDP, a temporary version can make eminent sense. Thank you very much for your attention.
Although interest in the idea of a universal basic income predates the COVID-19 crisis, there has been clearly a resurgence of interest in a UBI that is indicative of the necessity and importance of measures that are able to provide income security for everyone in a period of deep economic security, and that can address the kind of yawning inequalities that have not only been revealed, but also exacerbated by this crisis. Now, the emphasis on a basic level of income security to guarantee a floor on which recipients can stand echoes the social protection floor's recommendation of the ILO and is also reflected in the Sustainable Development Goal targets 1.3 and 3.8. Now, the ILO recommendation urges states to guarantee that at a minimum, all in need have access to essential healthcare and to basic income security over their life cycle, which together can secure effective access to goods and services defined as necessary at the national level. As Philip Alston has rightly pointed out, the UBI is not at odds with social protection floors. And in fact, the debates on these concepts should be brought together, which is what I would like to do very briefly here. However, before doing so, I think one clarification is in order. The motives for proposing the UBI have been and continue to be very diverse. From those who are seeking its emancipatory potential to empower individuals and to resource their freedoms, to the more kind of libertarian and neoliberal varieties aiming to replace the welfare state by a minimalist safety net. Adding confusion to this complexity, during the pandemic, the growing interest in UBI has also led to a tendency to label any vaguely universal income transfer as a UBI, even if it is targeted, temporary, conditional, or not even fully universal. Now, this takes me to the key question of whether a UBI is the optimal social policy to achieve income security and social justice. The short answer to that is, well, it depends. It depends on its design features and on how it coheres with other policies. So let me highlight three broad criteria, reflecting some of the fundamental principles of social security as a lens through which we can assess the potential of UBI to advance equity and social justice, and also to help us identify some of its possible pitfalls. First is the criterion of adequacy, to allow an escape from poverty and to enable a life in dignity for the recipients. Now, this depends not only on the level at which the benefit is set, for example, is it 50% of median income or the national poverty line, and so forth, but also the capacity of this benefit to remain adequate over time, which would require indexation, so that it keeps up with inflation, with wages, or a combination of the two. Now, an ILO estimate of the cost of a UBI that would be paid at 100% of the national poverty line to every adult and child for a sample of 130 countries showed that it would amount to a fiscal outlay of between 20 to 35% of GDP for most world regions. A major concern that this raises is that the potentially high costs of a UBI may lead policymakers to opt for very minimal benefit levels or to cut back on other benefits, which would therefore fail, and especially it would fail those with greater needs, such as persons with disabilities or those with health preconditions. Universal social protection, however, requires that everyone is protected throughout their life, as long as everyone is guaranteed adequate benefits if and when they need it. For example, when they're sick, when they face unemployment, or in old age. It does not necessarily require that everyone receives an equal benefit on a continuous basis. Secondly, the capacity of a UBI to prevent poverty and enhance equity and social justice is highly contingent on people's effective access to quality services. Now, while most advocates of UBI do not see it as in any way a substitute for the public provision of services, yet in a context of fiscal tightening, the potentially high costs of a UBI could rule out public investments in services, most notably healthcare, education, care, whether childcare or long-term care, as well as employment services, all of which are particularly important for those with care responsibilities, as well as young people who are seeking employment. And finally, the social protection floor's recommendation is particularly clear in spelling out that in order to achieve adequate levels of coverage beyond a social protection floor, states should progressively ensure higher levels of protection through social insurance to which both workers and employers would contribute and which promotes social solidarity across groups, for example, between those with lower and higher earnings or between those with good health and others with preconditions. And yet here there are concerns that the UBI can be used as a thin wedge to replace the contributory system with a very minimal and thin UBI, while encouraging those who can afford it to enroll in private insurance schemes, which will have very regressive effects. This would leave especially those with preconditions, those with care responsibilities, those who face interrupted careers, and also structural disadvantages with little recourse to economic security beyond a thin UBI, while at the same time letting employers off the hook. In short, while there is much to be said for a universal basic income that really puts a solid floor under everyone, the effective prevention of poverty and greater equality and social justice are not automatically outcomes and are highly contingent on the level at which such a benefit is set and how it coheres with the broader array of social services and public social insurance programs, which it cannot replace. Thank you.
Thanks a lot to the BN Network and to UNDP for the invitation to the roundtable. I'm really glad to be able to share the perspective of the ECLAC, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, or CEPAL in Spanish, on universal basic income. When discussing UBI in Latin America and the Caribbean, as in many other developing regions, we need to consider the context of structural socioeconomic problems, such as very high levels of inequality and informality, persistent and growing levels of poverty and vulnerability, and lack of social cohesion. And obviously, on top of that, we need to take into account the COVID-19 pandemic. In Latin America, about 50% of workers are informal, without access to social protection, and 79% of the population is either poor or vulnerable, with per capita incomes up to 3 times the poverty line, which is thus insufficient to protect them from a crisis. In a context of high inequality and in which labor markets have not been able to ensure universal social protection, a UBI seems like a good option, not only to guarantee basic needs and basic level of consumption, but also in terms of opening up spaces of greater autonomy and freedom for all people, especially women, young people, and other groups in situation of discrimination and subordination. In May 2020, a few months after the pandemic started hitting our region, the ECLAC, under the leadership of our Executive Secretary, Alicia Bárcena, proposed to the countries of the region to implement an emergency basic income. Initially, for 6 months, with an amount equivalent to the poverty line and directed to the entire population living in poverty. With variation, the EBI has indeed implemented in many countries of the region. And as the pandemic lasted longer than initially expected, we also suggested extending the EBI over a longer period of time. Even though we proposed an emergency basic income as a short-term response to the pandemic, at the ECLAC, we think that the medium and long-term policy goal is to implement a universal basic income. We see the UBI as a new and additional pillar of the welfare state, an expansion of rights, not the replacement of social conquest and benefits. This is an additional measure rather than the substitution of other much needed social programs and services. We recognize, however, that a full UBI is expensive. For instance, at the ECLAC, we have estimated the yearly average cost of a universal transfer equivalent to a poverty line in Latin America to be annually 19% of GDP. In comparison, total central government spending in 2019 was just 11.5% of GDP. Thus, the implementation of a UBI needs to be gradual and adapted to the realities of the countries of the region according to their fiscal capacities, social needs, and economic possibilities. It would also require a more effective tax system with much greater receipts, progressiveness, and redistributive capacity. What do we mean in practice with graduality? For instance, we think that a universal child rent would be an important step in the direction of a UBI. Children in the region suffer higher poverty rates than any other age group, and families with children have been particularly hit by the pandemic. We estimate that in 2020, 51.3% of children and adolescents in Latin America were poor. Thus, the risk of a lost generation is real, and the universal transfer to children would be important to sustain at least basic conditions of life and avoid the growth of child labor. This is the right time to discuss and promote a UBI all over the world, and in Latin America and the Caribbean in particular. The idea of a UBI has been discussed for quite a while in different countries of the region, even inspiring the implementation of social programs which share at least some of the elements of a UBI, such as individuality, universality, unconditionality, regularity, such as the universal child allowance in Argentina or pensions for older adults in Mexico and Bolivia. From a human rights standpoint, the implementation of a UBI in the region would represent an evolution of conditional cash transfers, which have been applied over the last 20 years and have legitimized cash transfers to families and the possibility and the rights to accessing income through a route which is different from that of asset ownership or employment. Also, with the pandemic, we observed that some of the emergency transfers, although temporary, are unconditional and have very broad coverage. A case in point is the universal emergency family income in Chile, which currently reaches about 17 million people, or 85% of the Chilean population. In conclusion, this is the time to strengthen the welfare state and universal social protection in Latin America and the Caribbean, and we think that this includes the gradual implementation of a universal basic income. Thanks a lot.
So, hello, my name is Anton Bjork. I'm with you from UN-ESCWA in Beirut. In this intervention, I will first give a brief overview of the social protection landscape in the Arab region. Doing so, I will try to pave the way for a discussion about the introduction of a UBI and mention a few examples of recent reforms that could possibly be seen as a movement in that direction. I will then mention a few points that from our perspective appear particularly relevant to bear in mind when discussing the prospect of a UBI. So, in the Arab region, social protection has for many years consisted in large part of general subsidies, especially on energy products such as fuel and electricity. There is now a broad consensus that this is not an optimal form of social protection. In particular, subsidies are extremely expensive to maintain and often regressive, meaning that the rich benefit more from them than the poor do. Around the region, governments are therefore in the process of reducing or even abolishing the general subsidies. In many cases, the subsidies are being replaced by cash transfer programs. Those programs are often quite narrowly targeted, aiming to cover only the poorest 10% or so, meaning in practice that the middle classes are by design excluded. However, there are a few examples of more comprehensive cash transfer programs being introduced to cushion the negative effects of subsidy reductions and, of course, of concomitant crises such as the pandemic. For the purpose of this Congress, a highly pertinent question is whether these relatively comprehensive cash transfer programs could be the precursor of an actual UBI later on. Let me give you a few examples. In Saudi Arabia, the consumer prices of petrol have more than tripled in the last 5 years as the general subsidies are being phased out. To compensate for these and other reforms, the government has introduced a cash transfer program called the Citizen Account, which covers around a third of the national population. In Sudan, fuel prices were fully liberalized in June this year as the subsidies were lifted. Meanwhile, the government is rolling out a cash transfer scheme called the Family Support Program, intended to cover around 4/5 of the population. In Lebanon, the fuel subsidies financed by the central bank will very soon have to be lifted. To soften the socio-economic repercussions of this, the government will reportedly provide cash transfers to around 750,000 households, which would correspond to somewhere around half of the national population. Meanwhile, as you know, several Arab countries are plagued by conflict, and in such contexts, humanitarian aid plays a central role. While this is indispensable in the short term, the humanitarian aid needs in the longer term to be replaced by nationally owned measures. So a combination of UBI and development aid could possibly be an essential part of the post-conflict reconstruction effort. Before concluding, let me quickly mention some aspects that seem particularly pertinent to bear in mind and to discuss further. First of all, the Arab region is extremely diverse, including some of the poorest countries in the world as well as some of the richest ones. So would the UBI make sense in all of these different contexts or merely in some of them? Well, on the one hand, mobilizing the resources for UBI might seem particularly challenging in the poorest countries. On the other hand, in these countries, poverty is often very widespread, and accurately estimating people's income or wealth is typically more difficult than in richer countries. This would appear to argue in favor of universalism as opposed to targeting. Lebanon is another interesting example to discuss. On the one hand, the country is in a deep financial crisis. From one perspective, this could seem to limit the scope for social spending and necessitate that the scarce resources be provided only to those most in need. On the other hand, the situation in the country makes it very difficult to determine who needs assistance and who does not, notably since an extremely large number of households are experiencing deteriorating living conditions at the same time. Another very important question is whether a UBI could be perceived as more legitimate and just than poverty-targeted social assistance. In particular, could it help ensuring so-called middle-class buy-in and make it politically possible to continue phasing out the general subsidies? Moreover, it is critical to consider the potential impact of a UBI on labor markets in the region. For one thing, how might the UBI affect the level of economic activity among women and youth, which presently is lower in the Arab region than anywhere else in the world? Moreover, as the fourth industrial revolution advances worldwide, we enter a new era of lifelong learning. Will the UBI aid in the reskilling and upskilling process for those who are losing their jobs? Thank you very much for having listened. I know, of course, that most of you who attend this Congress know infinitely more about the UBI than we do, so it would be highly beneficial from our perspective if you in the following discussion could reconnect to some of these issues and thereby help enhancing our understanding. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is a great pleasure to be here today and to be talking to you. My presentation will be structured in 3 key parts. I will first talk about the angle through which here at UNESCO we work on basic income. Second, about the issues we identified. And third, about the areas for action we crystallized as a result of this work. So let me start very briefly with the angle. We work here at the UNESCO Management of Social Transformations program and the UNESCO Inclusive Policy Lab. Both of these are mandated with building a sustained and systematic knowledge policy nexus, meaning we strengthen the link between what we know and how we act upon that through public policy. And that is exactly what we are doing on basic income. We need to depolarize the debate and to allow for informed policy on basic income. For this, an open conversation is to be had on what we actually know and what we are missing on this matter. That is the focus of my presentation today. Let me start with what we know and what is available. I roughly structured in 4 points. Fast and critical. Now we have data on how basic income performs in both stable and volatile settings. Trials have been run before and during the pandemic, and many will emerge in the post-COVID world, when and if that comes. Put together, these are important in 2 respects. A, this can and should guide the debates on basic income as a standing policy instrument, and B, they can inform the deployment of basic income as an emergency response in humanitarian, development, and various crisis contexts. And this is key. Regretfully, COVID-19 is one of the many mega crises to come. Think of the looming turmoil of the climate change and the socioeconomic impact of that. Now, understanding how cash and basic income may or may not alleviate these shocks is critical in preparing response options. The good news is that we have data to guide us on this account. Point number 2, basic income has been implemented both in Global North and in Global South. It's not a rich country issue, and many of the panelists will be talking about this. This is important, especially as we start talking more and more of basic income in conjunction with agendas such as SDGs, and I'll talk about this a bit later too. Point number 3, financing is key to basic income. What is to be underlined is that there is more and more data and thinking emerging on A, distributive performance of basic income and ways of calibrating that through its financing, and B, on sources of financing, meaning traditional sources and innovative sources. For example, carbon price at dividend, data-driven funding, dividends from marketing socially owned data, and so on. All this knowledge is critical if the intention is to go beyond individual trials towards to-scale, longer-term, sustained basic income. They also matter greatly when it comes to public buy-in and to political acceptability of basic income, and we all know that financing is key to that. The last point is on the effects and impacts of basic income, on which we have data, especially at the individual level and coming from trials. The issue is that often the contextual differences and particular setups of these trials are under-analyzed in debates, and that in doing that, we run the risk of reading the results in a skewed way if we disregard the context. Now, what we're missing and what are the loopholes in our knowledge? First is scale. Much of what we know comes from trials, as I already said, and limited schemes with some exceptions. But what are the effects and the paths to scale up need deeper and more serious digging. Second, alternative and adjacent policy ideas need serious exploration. Third, key gaps exist in the understanding of basic income as part of the system rather than a standalone game-changing solution. 2 things are important here. 1, what are the links of basic income with minimum wage, pensions, severance pay, and so on? And B, what is the interplay of basic income with broader societal agendas such as gender, equity, political participation, and the international frameworks, meaning if and how basic income fits into the SDGs or climate commitments. Now, what can be done to close these gaps? Functionally, the task is dual. 1 is to strengthen the knowledge base through scouting, aggregating, and effectively diffusing high-quality evidence on basic income. And second, on the policy side, the work is to build capacity and engagement of policymakers and decision makers with that knowledge base. Substantively, the work has to be on basic income, its variations, and adjacent and alternative ideas. Importantly, the interplay of basic income with the joint agendas of SDGs, gender and climate, and so on, need deeper exploration. Geographically, the work has to cover both global north and global south, and the ambition should be clear in terms of bridging the silos of different policy experiments and jurisdictional limits. Now, that was my presentation, brief, I hope. I'm happy to elaborate on any points and address any questions during the Q&A session. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much to our speakers of panel 1. You have given us a lot to reflect on for our third interactive segment. And I see a lot of interesting reactions and questions coming on the Woover regarding to your presentations. So colleagues, now it is my pleasure to introduce panel 2. Panel 2 will discuss the implementation challenges and opportunities with basic income, including what are the lessons from the COVID-19 response with UBI, the delivery methods applied by countries using digital technologies to expand the rate of coverage, what are the limitations of existing social protection programs in any specific context, country or regional context, and how UBI can be effective to build the resilience of countries and communities moving forward. Some key perceived limitations to be explored by our panelists will include fiscal affordability and administrative capacities that have been also highlighted by our panelists during the panel 1, and how to finance UBI through fiscal and taxes and other means. Without overdue, let us hear from our panelists from the World Bank, IMF, Unito, and we will close panel 2 with Professor Guy Standing from SOAS-BN, delivering overall insights and reflections on what we have heard from our panelists thus far. So let us hear from our panelists on panel 2. Thank you.
Hello, it's a pleasure for me to join the Basic Income Congress session, and I'm going to talk in the panel on the implementation issues coming from the social protection responses to COVID-19. My presentation is going to cover 3 topics. First is overview of the universal transfers in the context of social protection responses to the crisis. The second one, I'm trying to pose a question, are those universal transfers or near universal transfers that we see as a response same as UBI? And the third one, what are the lessons from COVID-19 response for UBI implementation? Many countries introduce universal or near universal cash transfers grants as a response to COVID-19. According to our count, which is published in the latest live paper, review of the social protection measures, 12 countries, as diverse as Japan, Mongolia, Tuvalu, Korea, Serbia, Israel, Bolivia, Timor-Leste, Hong Kong, Singapore, Peru, El Salvador, Georgia, Samoa, use this method with the coverage range between 100% and 70%. Most countries managed to implement these universal cash grants without delays and without irregularities in implementation. But these were part of the much larger set of social protection responses to the crisis. Overall, more than 3,000 measures were introduced worldwide in 222 countries. Cash transfers alone represented 700 cases in more than 180 countries. These were mostly temporary transfers. Average duration was 4 months, and most universal grants were one-off or just several rounds of payments. Where generous, these transfers represented a significant amount in terms of the fiscal outlay. One case, interesting case, is Mongolia. Mongolia had almost universal basic child grant, cash money program that was covering about 80% of the population, families with children. And these were scaled up 4 times as a response to the pandemic. These, however, amounted for about $30 per month. As it was judged to be insufficient, when implementing the second wave of major lockdowns, the government of Mongolia introduced another one-time universal cash transfer, in that case covering 100% of the population, with a grant of about $100. Combined, these two measures costed about 6.5% of GDP. There are fundamental differences between these universal grant responses and the UBI idea. First of all, they were one-off rather than permanent, with very clear end scenarios. The second one, they were mostly conditional, even if implicitly, on population compliant with the mitigation measures. But there are also similarities. The universal character, simplified application procedures, reliant on modern banking system, population registries, and massive outreach to ensure a universal coverage. What are the lessons for UBI implementation from these COVID-19 responses? One lesson is that in the modern world, scale up of the cash transfers is relatively easy. On average, the scale up across all countries was 250%. That's it, the coverage was more than double in a space of several months. The second lesson is that even if temporary, this benefit could actually mitigate against the major increases in poverty triggered by the COVID-19 mitigation measures. But they were costly. And in many cases, especially in poorer countries, they stretched the limit of fiscal affordability. Expansion was possible using the combination of approaches in most cases and relied strongly on modern technology. It relied on administrative registries, on the modern ID systems. It went well beyond the social protection traditional registries and lists of beneficiaries. The payments were relied again heavily on the modern digital delivery method. These digital delivery methods were used in 155 programs in 58 countries. They were part of the mix, but one has to say that 55 programs in 35 countries relied exclusively on manual methods of delivery. So there is still a big agenda of using modern digital payments to extend the coverage of social protection and make it more transparent and more efficient. The expansion rate of this digital delivery when used was over 40%. So in conclusion, I would like to say that what this experience is telling us is that the technical limit for expansion of cash transfers is not the main question that the basic income proponents or advocates should be worried about. The fiscal affordability definitely is, and the political support is. I wish this panel and overall this Congress to push the limits for discussing these two major issues. Thank you very much for your attention.
When I started my career nearly 30 years ago, one of my first projects was to analyze the impact of a universal basic income in the Netherlands, a uniform cash transfer for each individual above 18 years old. Proponents came from right to left. The right-wing proponents wanted to replace the existing cash transfer system, mostly consisting of means-tested but some universal benefits for children and elderly, for a UBI, arguing it would be much simpler to administer and eliminate abuse. But they kept the budget for the cash transfers the same, and the result was a UBI that was much lower than the current transfers to the poorest. So inequality and poverty increased. The left-wing proponents proposed the UBI equal to the existing cash transfer to the poorest. This protected them against income loss, and moreover, it removed the poverty trap that was caused by the means testing, and thus improved the incentives for them to move up the income ladder. But it came at a high cost, as the UBI was universal. The calculation suggested that a flat personal income tax rate of 53% was necessary to finance it, which created large distortions in employment. So compared to the UBI, the existing system of means-tested benefits seemed a more efficient way to mitigate inequality. The global discussion today often focuses on developing countries where issues are quite different. These countries usually don't have the same means-tested cash transfers like the Netherlands. And where cash transfer systems do exist, many of the very poor don't have access to them. Now, suppose a UBI could be implemented in these countries, and it would reach a much wider share of the poor population, for instance, by using biometric identification and mobile money payments. What would be the impacts? We can draw lessons from an analysis in the IMF Fiscal Monitor in 2017, which showed simulations for 8 countries of a UBI equal to 25% of the median per capita income. It finds that the Gini coefficient drops by 5.3 points on average. Poverty drops by 10.4 points. The fiscal costs are 6.5% of GDP for advanced economies and 4% for emerging market economies. So the key question is how to finance it. One, if financed by eliminating existing transfer schemes, we face an important trade-off. Like in the Netherlands case, the poor who are already covered by existing schemes will lose. However, those not yet covered and who will receive the UBI will gain. For instance, in South Africa, 65% of the people in the first 2 deciles of the income distribution would lose on average 19% of their disposable income. But the remaining 35% of them would actually gain 150% of disposable income. Compared to South Africa, the existing coverage of transfers in countries like Egypt, Brazil, and Mexico is much smaller, which makes the UBI then more attractive. But in Brazil, for instance, progressivity is also much higher than in South Africa, so that the poor already covered would likely lose even more. So the trade-off varies country by country. The UBI could also be financed by higher taxes. From an equity point of view, the most appealing is, of course, financing through progressive taxes. And in most countries, the options might be rather limited in the short term due to weak administrative capacity and because of the distortions it would create. But other taxes might be considered too, as the UBI would still reduce poverty and inequality. Raising tax ratios seems imperative, but has proven difficult, yet not impossible. But there is another dilemma too. The UBI in most countries will compete with other spending priorities, such as in healthcare, education, digital infrastructure, and other public investments in roads, electricity, and water. The feasibility of the UBI as a way to reduce poverty and inequality thus depends on many factors that will vary country by country.
Thank you very much for inviting Unito today at this Basic Income Congress. Today, together with Ms. Diana Bajour, we're going to present the rationale for piloting basic income in complement to Unito's technical assistance. Unito rationale for piloting basic income is Unito being a specialized agency in the UN system that promotes inclusive and sustainable industrial development. And in the area of my work, we try to restore people's livelihoods, especially in post-conflict setting, through entrepreneurship development, skills training, and provision of equipment and tools for business startups. And by doing so, we support small businesses, including agribusiness. We see the potential of business basic income to increase liquidity to cover basic needs of the beneficiaries, who are refugees, internally displaced people, and also host communities, so that their livelihoods and businesses are sustainable. For Unito, basic income is socioeconomic recovery tool and not a social protection tool. Globally, there aren't so many initiatives combining technical assistance with unconditional cash. So what we are trying to do is, I think is innovative.
So to do this, Unito did a feasibility of a basic income pilot, and it would be a pilot testing basic income alongside technical assistance in northern Iraq. So northern Iraq is the Kurdish area of Iraq, and it's the area of interest because it houses large numbers of refugees, IDPs, and host communities. Locally, there is a widespread use of unconditional but targeted cash by humanitarian and development organizations, as well as by the Iraqi government. We found that cash is the preferred method by beneficiaries, as well as the international organizations in terms of supporting the most vulnerable. In Iraq, and specifically northern Iraq, there is a call for complementing cash with technical skills for greater resilience and self-reliance of beneficiaries. And what is also interesting for the pilot is that there is an existing solid and flexible infrastructure for transferring cash through mobile phones. And so beneficiaries are quite used to and comfortable with using their phones for this form of cash transfers. In terms of the design features of a potential pilot, we found that we can achieve universality by transferring a basic income in a small camp setting. For example, a camp called Mamilan. This camp houses about 200 families, which makes about 1,000 individuals who would receive the basic income. The amount, given our quite limited budget, would be $22 per adult, half of that per child, where a family of 5 would receive $75 a month, which is equivalent to the Iraqi poverty line. In this pilot, interested camp residents would receive a Unito technical training and assistance. We would also have a control group in a remote but comparable location. The timeline of the project would be between 18 and 24 months. And for Unito, the research questions of interest are basic income's impact on the general well-being of beneficiaries, on their engagement in productive activities, and the survival and growth of their small businesses. We would also be looking at the general impact of the local economy, and also the impact in terms of the community and social relations.
In the meantime, we also faced a number of challenges that I would like to share with you. First of all, we had extensive internal discussion on universality. Given the limited budget that we have, we cannot roll out the full-fledged UBI, so we had to identify a few locations with a small number of residents for piloting. And this is not easy. This is not very often very easy exercise. And number two is also convincing donors. We reached out to 2 donors, and one donor happened to be hesitant to allocate cash in the project, because the project was intended for development purpose and not for humanitarian purpose. The other donor we approached was hesitant to unconditionality, and they wanted to track beneficiary spending. So we are still looking for potential donors who may be interested to join forces to pilot the basic income along with the scheme. And lastly, do no harm. We also realized that there is a possibility to create tensions by piloting the basic income in a particular location, be it camp or village or community, knowing that other people, communities will not receive this cash transfer. So this is the challenges that we have faced, and thank you very much. We look forward to our discussion, and we hope to stay in touch. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Professor Guy, I believe your audio is not working. Thank you so much.
I think it is now. Is it
Okay.
working now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay.
We can hear you.
Well, first of all, there is a video of my remarks longer than I'm going to be speaking now. So if anyone wishes to consult that afterwards, it's available. You're listening to somebody who's been strangely involved in promoting basic income for well over 30 years while I was in the ILO and working in the UN system. And for many, many of those years, there was complete hostility, particularly in the World Bank, the IMF, and the Social Security Department of the ILO. So I'm delighted to see how events have changed and the momentum has shifted. I've been involved, as I say, in pilots in 5 continents. And I've summarized the findings in several books. And I think it's very important to take account of the existing findings in making the assessments that we're making now and that I'm listening to. The interesting thing is that the ILO, and I'm really delighted that Shara is leading the Social Protection Department now, has a Convention 102 of 1952, which in 2001 was declared up to date. But anybody reading that convention should be ashamed, because it's the most sexist social security convention you could possibly imagine, with breadwinners and regarding women as very much secondary workers, and it should be pushed out of the window as whatever, and called not up to date. But I would like to make 3 key pleas to all of us in and around the UN system today. First, do not let us say it is unaffordable. It is affordable, and back of the envelope estimates by taking a poverty line and multiplying it by the population size and then working that out as a percentage of GDP is bad economics, very bad economics. It ignores a number of factors. First of all advocates of basic income, particularly those on the progressive bent, believe that it should be taxed back from the wealthy. That's the first point. The second, of course, it would be replacing some other schemes, in particular subsidies. Now, what is not taken into account in costing exercises is that subsidies, which are regressive and huge, often come to much more than 5% of GDP in developing countries as well as in rich countries. And of course, they should be phased out. It also ignores the feedback effects. What we found, and I've summarized that in the books, is that the multiplier of a basic income is considerable. In other words, if you spend $1, it generates 1 point something dollars in extra output. And contrary to prejudice, basic income increases work. The word increases work should be remembered, rather than the prejudice that it reduces work. The evidence is overwhelming, the reasoning is very strong, and so on. And I think that this is also very important for thinking about the feminist issues, because it increases women's capacity to participate in economic activity and to produce more and gain greater status. Bolsa Familia showed this in Brazil, but also pilots around the world. The second thing is that we should remember that both in the financial crash of 2008 and in the COVID dilemma that we're facing, governments have suddenly found that it's easy to raise and spend vast amount of money in quantitative easing, billions of dollars they've suddenly managed to find, and they've gone to the banks and to the wealthy and have increased inequality. We need a quantitative easing for people. Now, as far as the way to pay for a basic income, I believe the best way forward would be to set up capital funds, common funds, along the lines of the Norwegian Fund or the Alaska Permanent Fund, or a number of the sovereign wealth funds that exist. And it was very interesting to hear Anton's remarks on that. But in addition, we need tax reform. We cannot address this issue without addressing the threat of extinction. We need high carbon taxes, and I mean high, if we're going to genuinely tackle fossil fuels and greenhouse gas emissions. But of course, they cannot be done unless you recycle the income. Otherwise, they're very regressive. Recycle the income in paying for part of the basic income. The same, we see wealth inequality has grown much more than income inequality. Therefore, we need to shift to taxing wealth. A 1% or 2% wealth tax in most countries could pay for a decent basic income. Not a total, but well towards paying for a decent basic income. And of course, we need a land value tax as well. So we need to shift our taxation. And from those sources, you can build up a capital fund from which you can be paying out a growing basic income. And that's the next point I want to make. The important thing in 2021 is for all of us to be on the road towards a basic income as an anchor of a new income distribution system, rather than going away from it, as has been the case in many social protection systems as they move towards more behavior testing, means testing, sanctions, and so on. We need to move in a different direction. And the other point I want to make is that we must not fall into the trap of what Albert Hirschman warned about the claims of perversity. He said that every progressive social policy, when it's proposed, induces people to say, no, don't do it, because it will endanger something else. And then when it's introduced, those criticisms fade away, because we must individual policies, and that is what I think is vital. Now, I want to end my comments by saying, I think this initiative is fantastic. I think the UNDP needs tremendous credit for initiating this, and I welcome everybody who's contributed today. And I hope that the UNDP will become a coordinating body with the ILO in particular, because they are responsible for social protection internationally, in terms of building up the methodologies, building up the findings, creating a bank of people qualified to be able to go out and help do the pilots that are still being needed, particularly the sort of pilots that Noriko and Diana have been talking about in disaster zones, where emergency schemes can actually reinvigorate the community and engender a revival of the economy and society. That is what we need today. And I think this initiative is something that I'm going to keep my fingers crossed, because I think some wonderful people are going to contribute. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Guy, and for this injection of energy and being also always polemic and reminding us of the core issues, right? I think this is the right way to start our discussion now. We have 12 minutes, so I'm very grateful to have this 12 minutes. We received a lot of reactions and questions in our Wova chat. And actually, Professor Guy raised the issues that I really would like us to tackle on here, and to hear the perspectives from the different organizations present here today, which is related to this issue of affordability, prejudice, related to UBI. And the first thing will be to hear from our panelists general reflections, what the UN and its partners can do to do a better business case with countries, with governments, to promote UBI, right? So first is a reflection, and Professor Guy has laid out some policy instruments that could be adopted. I would like to hear from our panelists, from your work, from your respective organizations, how the UN can promote a better business case to get rid of this prejudice and work with the countries to promote UBI. The second would be, in responding to that, can we differentiate between a response in developing middle-income countries and low-income countries, and also countries that are in high indebted countries, because we've seen that rising and crisis is a reality. So when thinking about that business case, how do we differentiate that? Many of you also have brought up the issue of normal settings and country in crisis. So making this business case in crisis settings, how will that differentiate? So I'm opening the floor. I already see Simon has raised his hand. I'd like to invite all the panelists to please raise your hand I'd like to hear your reactions to that. Simon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Very briefly, first of all, saying that the UBI, at least in LAC, has been also promoted by the Secretary General of the UN. You can all see a report on the impact of COVID-19 in the region, where he says, well, we should think of moving forward. Guy rightly said that it is affordable, but I don't think it's bad economics to put numbers on the cost of a UBI under different scenarios. That's what we do at the ECLAC. And I think it's very important. We do it in the social panorama of Latin America. We show the costs of different options and also the impacts, how it reduces poverty and inequality. I think it's important to have the figures up, and then they can be discussed and see how we can finance this. And on the second question is on mix and leaks. I think in our region, for instance, in Latin America, we have countries that are upper income like Chile or lower income like Haiti. I think this is an idea that works for all the countries. Say Haiti, sure, they don't have the budget to finance a UBI right now in their coffers, but there is so much money going for emergency responses every time a disaster strikes. So a UBI, a permanent support for the population, is important even in low income settings. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Simon, for those reflections. Let's go to Balázs Hovard from UNDP. Balázs, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me start with rule number 1 of crisis management. When you find yourself in a hole, first stop digging. I would begin by referring to Guy's points. We have a hole in front, we are in a hole in terms of climate change. We have to get rid of fossil fuel subsidies, and because of the externalities of burning fossil fuels, we also have to impose a carbon tax. If we do that, we create a huge amount of fiscal space. Not all of it has to go to UBI, but a significant portion can, because it will also create an income effect. So on top of the problems we face, we also have an additional problem of the income effect from all these measures. But it creates the actual fiscal space for it. There is also additional thoughts. For example, in Asia Pacific, the big problem is that if you exclude China, 75% of people are workers are in the informal sector. And the social protection gap is to a large extent linked to this. So some things need to happen to make informality smaller. If we do that, that actually will raise the tax base. It will increase the tax base, and therefore, again, fiscal space can be created. All this has to be done with the recognition that we are facing global shocks. So all these policies cannot be only at the level of individual countries. It has to be globally coordinated. And that brings me to the OECD idea of having a minimum tax on large multinationals who currently are completely avoiding taxes. Let me just stop here. I want to let others to talk also. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Balázs. And let's hear the insights from Shara from ILO on this topic.
Yeah, thank you. It was really very interesting listening to all these very diverse and rich perspectives. And just a few thoughts. I think one is, what can the UN do? I think by showing that transfers and social protection transfers and social policies are productive, and it's not an unproductive form. It is an investment and it has economic payoffs, and we can show that even short-term economic payoffs through the kind of multipliers that are created, particularly in contexts of crisis, in context of humanitarian crisis included. So those kind of economic payoffs, I think, go a long way in showing the way in which this dichotomy between social and economic policy is a false dichotomy. Social investments do have economic payoffs. I think that's very important. I think I couldn't agree more with everything that was said about the need to really increase the fiscal space, and the fact that we need to be thinking about taxes, carbon taxes, of course, but also, yes, indeed, corporate and wealth taxes, which corporate taxes have been going down during this period when capital has been very free to move and labor is stuck geographically. So we really need to be redressing those kinds of taxes and increasing the fiscal space. Otherwise, we end up with what I heard several speakers say about the way in which a UBI or other kind of transfer can be seen as having to make a trade-off between investing in transfers or a UBI or investing in public services. And these are really complementary. And if we talk about a gender perspective, and I heard that a lot, women need care services, a lot. They need in-kind services very much. They need investments in water and sanitation to reduce the drudgery of unpaid work. And this is not something that one can solve if you only have individual transfers, a UBI or other kind of transfers. Public investments are absolutely necessary and complementary. So that I think is really important to bear in mind as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shara. Let's move on to Ruud from World Bank. Floor is yours.
From the IMF.
Sorry, apologies. From the IMF.
No problem, no problem.
I was bound to make that mistake.
No. Sorry, getting my earplugs out. So thanks a lot for giving me the floor, and thanks a lot for all the contributions. I think it was really excellent, and also Guy's plea was very impressive. Also very interested in the book. I do think the affordability issue is very important. So building tax capacity in countries is going to be so crucial, not only for cash transfers, but also for many other priorities in countries. And this is also where the IMF spends a lot of its efforts in building tax capacity in countries, mainly in the area of tax administration, because if we want to think about enforcing progressive taxes going forward, a major sort of impediment to that is the revenue administration and how to deal with it, how to implement digital solutions in tax administrations and so on. I think it's often underestimated how difficult it is to actually make progress on the revenue mobilization side, also politically, because if you look at the political discussions on revenue mobilization, of course, politicians often move towards the easy solutions. We want to tax the foreign companies, we want to reduce tax evasion, but these are things that have proved to be quite difficult. So I think a realistic plan for how to actually make progress in revenue mobilization is very important. And of course, issues on taxing big corporations is very important because that's part of where the money is. Automatic exchange of information is going to be very important, but it's also hard to build now on sort of assumptions on improvements in that regard. I do think also that we need to consider other ways of financing, and I think some of the examples that were mentioned, like carbon tax, getting rid of energy subsidies, but also what countries currently do is, for instance, in their VAT systems, having a lot of exemptions, which is a very inefficient way of trying to reach the poor, to relieve them from the tax burden. And cash transfers is a much more efficient way of achieving them. So a reform whereby you expand these taxes, which are not particularly progressive, but raise a lot of revenue, and using that for cash transfers can probably be a very good policy for anti-poverty.
Thank you so much, Ruud from the IMF. Colleagues, we are approaching very quickly the end of our session, unfortunately, but I'd like to invite Julia, and then perhaps to close, just quick remarks from Professor Guy Standing to close us this session, this beautiful session. So Julia, the floor from UNESCO. Julia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So just brief comments on what the UN can do to promote UBI. I think linking it to agendas such as SDG, climate commitments, gender, and so on and so forth is a big step. It is up to us to demonstrate, if it's the case indeed, that UBI could serve as an instrument to those ends. And it's probably only us who could do this at the multilateral level and in country, going through all the levels. And second point, very briefly, many speakers mentioned reallocation of existing resources and traditional sources of financing, but there is a lot of thinking on innovative ways. carbon tax was mentioned by many speakers, data monetization, dividends from marketing socially owned data. That's a big thing too being discussed. So when we talk about UBI and making the case, and that was your original question, we shouldn't limit ourselves to what has been done, but try to push the envelope and to aggregate the existing knowledge and emerging thinking on that, and then put it in practical and policy relevant terms. And I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think those words were great, you know, to push the envelope and to do beyond what we have done so far. Yulia, it was perfect to come to a close. And I'm going to apologize to all our panelists. I know that many of you would like to make more additional remarks and inputs to this session, but I want to invite Professor Guy Standing to lead us to closure with final words. Professor Guy, thank you so much, everybody.
Well, thank you very much.
Yes.
I will conclude quickly by saying that we're on a road. And it's very important for everybody to realize that pilots that we've been doing and pilots by others have shown that even a very modest, inadequate basic income has positive effects. It results in improvements in health, in schooling, in sanitation. It induces a different community orientation. It improves various attitudes and risk-taking. And that is a very important finding. You don't have to go leaping just to a full basic income that we might like ideally to have. And the key point is this: the emancipatory value of a basic income is greater than the money value. I assure you, if you think that through and you see the dynamics, then that is the case. And to Simon, I fully agreed with his comeback points, but what I was getting at is just don't do the crude adjustments, do a genuine modeling, do include the feedback effects, the fact that public health improves, so it improves the fiscal space, etc. And then, of course, you need modeling. I'm not against modeling at all. We've done a lot ourselves. So I think what we're on is a road, and I salute everybody. And I just hope that this is the beginning of a coordinated set of activities that BIEN and UNDP will coordinate with the rest of us. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Echoing those words, that's not the end, that's just the beginning. The road is ahead. The COVID-19 recovery is yet to be started in many countries. Thank you so much for all of you that have joined us, for those that have, you know, in very prohibitive times. Thank you, colleagues. It has been a wonderful session. Thank you. The conversation will continue. Thank you so much.
La luta continua.